The invitation arrived just a few days before the broadcast. An unexpected email that suddenly appeared at the top of Karoline Leavitt's inbox. The subject line was clear and direct. You are invited to an important panel discussion. But as someone experienced in the game, she immediately sensed this wasn't a friendly invitation. When she opened it, her suspicions were confirmed. The panel was titled Media Accountability and Modern Politics. On the surface, it seemed like an innocent and neutral discussion, but the reality was far from it. One quick look at the guest list made everything clear. This wasn't a dialogue. It was a carefully orchestrated ambush. Across from her would be figures from the liberal media people who had spent years claiming impartiality while subtly pushing a specific narrative at every opportunity. The speakers were powerful names, operating on their own turf, playing by their own rules, shaping public perception for years. Karoline was the outsider, the disruption, the only one capable of derailing their agenda. In that moment, she realized this wasn't an invitation to discuss it, was a setup designed to discredit her. Her views were facts that threatened their narrative, and now they were prepared to use all their influence to silence her. At first, declining seemed like an option. In such a rigged setting, she knew she'd be placed squarely in the crosshairs under the guise of neutrality. But wouldn't backing down only prove them right? This was exactly what they wanted to make her hesitant, to keep her from stepping into the spotlight. They wanted her to look weak, to stay silent. But that was where they had made their biggest mistake. They had underestimated her, and she was determined to prove it. Inside the studio, there was quiet yet palpable tension as the crew made final preparations for the live broadcast. Karoline adjusted the clip-on microphone, and for a brief moment, her eyes caught her reflection on one of the bright monitors. The setting was sleek and professional dark wood tables, lighting arranged to create just the right shadows and contrasts. But it was all an illusion. A structure carefully designed to give the appearance of neutrality while subtly guiding the conversation in a predetermined direction. Every detail had been set up against her. The figures seated across from her were seasoned veterans of the media world, masters of subtle political maneuvering, skilled at steering audiences toward their intended conclusions. But Karoline had something that could shatter the carefully built foundation they had spent years constructing. The real challenge was how to use it. This wasn't just about arguments, it was about composure, about strategy. The next few minutes wouldn't just shape her career. They had the potential to ignite a nationwide discussion on how media narratives were truly formed. The cameras rolled. A familiar jingle echoed through the studio. The host's voice welcomed viewers to a thought-provoking discussion. But Karoline knew the truth. This wasn't going to be a discussion. She was ready. Now, it was time to turn their game against them. She knew it was a trap. The invitation wasn't just a call for debate. Hidden between the lines was a carefully crafted plan, an ambush designed with precision. They wanted to catch her off guard, corner her with impulsive reactions, and most importantly, twist her words to tarnish her image in the public eye. Karoline had seen this play out countless times before. Different names, same tactics, different words, but always the same strategy. But this time, things would be different. Their first mistake was assuming she would back down. Instead of retreating, Karoline accepted the invitation. But she had no intention of stepping onto their stage in a defensive position. This wouldn't just be a debate, it would become a platform to expose the hypocrisy of the media, the distorted system, and the selective nature of their so-called justice. She wouldn't play by their rules. They thought they were putting her in the crosshairs. But what they didn't realize was that she was ready to rewrite the rules of the game. Under the dim studio lights, long-standing narratives, carefully constructed perceptions, and supposedly unshakable reputations would be put to the test. Karoline was about to dismantle their script and reveal the truth. As she stepped through the doors of the Washington television studio, she immediately felt the weight of the atmosphere around her. Cold yet measured smiles, professional yet distant handshakes. There was tension lingering in every corner of the room. The other panelists sitting across from her were familiar faces, figures who had spent years presenting the truth to audiences, the architects of public perception. These were the people who dictated what society should think. Karoline wasn't meeting them for the first time. She knew the media's unwritten rules and the strategies that played out behind the scenes all too well. But this time, she wouldn't just be a spectator or a critic, would be at the center of the stage, right in the middle of their game. Minutes before the broadcast, as the sound technician clipped the microphone onto her, Karoline took a brief moment to scan the figures seated behind the studio desk. Everyone here was convinced they had control over the conversation. Pre-approved questions, expected answers, well-defined boundaries. But Karoline didn't recognize those boundaries. She wasn't here to give them what they wanted, she was here to say what they feared to hear. The final countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The red light flashed on. The broadcast had begun. The atmosphere in the studio was heavy, a silence thick with tension before a single word was even spoken. Karoline knew exactly who she was up against. These were the seasoned figures who had spent years shaping public opinion, bending words with precision to steer the truth in their chosen direction. Sometimes they wore the mask of neutrality. Other times, they openly championed specific narratives. But the real issue wasn't what they said, it was what they chose to leave unsaid. At the head of the table sat Charles Whitman, different from the rest. He wasn't the type to openly declare his stance. His craft was more refined. He knew how to frame issues, how to keep discussions within carefully set boundaries, subtly guiding the audience's perception without them even realizing it. His controlled biases were what made him a dangerous opponent. Karoline knew exactly how Whitman played this game, but tonight, she was determined to set the rules herself. As she stepped into the studio, Whitman approached with a slight smile, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. We're looking forward to the discussion," he said. Polite, warm, even at least on the surface. But Karoline had no trouble reading between the lines. This wasn't a friendly gathering. This was an arena where every word would be weighed, where the slightest hesitation would be seen as weakness. Whitman's greeting wasn't just a formality. It was a quiet challenge. His eyes said it all. "Let's see how long you last." Karoline returned his smile, shaking his hand without breaking eye contact. "So am I," she replied. As she took her seat, the rest of the panel studied her carefully. Their polite yet distant demeanor was meant to create the illusion of an impartial debate. But Karoline knew better. This wasn't a courtroom, but she was the one in the defendant's chair, and the jury had already reached its verdict. The countdown began. The studio lights dimmed slightly, cameras locked into position. As the familiar intro music played, Whitman's voice filled the air. "Tonight, we engage in a crucial discussion about media accountability. We'll take a deep dive into whether information is truly neutral, how journalism is shaped, and how public perception is influenced." His tone was professional, his delivery flawless. He was offering the audience what seemed like an insightful debate, but Karoline knew what this really was. The true purpose of this discussion was to corner her. "Karoline, you've been outspoken about media bias for a long time, but some argue that this is merely a political strategy, an attack on objective journalism rather than a valid critique. How do you respond to that?" The first move had been made. Whitman had framed his question carefully. If Karoline simply said, "Yes, the media is biased," she would be pulled into a debate that made her arguments appear weak. But instead of reacting immediately, she took a steady breath, letting her gaze drift around the table, making eye contact with each panelist. "First of all, questioning the media is not an attack on journalism," she said, her voice calm but firm. "If the media plays such a crucial role in society, then scrutinizing it is not only fair, it's necessary. But the issue isn't just bias. The real problem is the double standard. One political figure is condemned for a particular act, while another gets a pass for doing the same thing. One story makes headlines, another is quietly ignored. How do you explain that?" A brief silence followed. Whitman recognized the shift in the conversation, but didn't let it show. He kept his smile in place, nodding slightly. "Of course, there can be debates over how stories are handled," he said. "But instead of blaming journalists, shouldn't we be discussing how the system itself functions?" Karoline saw what he was trying to do: regain control. But tonight, Whitman wasn't the only one setting the stage. Karoline hadn't come here just to participate in the debate. She'd come to rewrite it. And she hadn't even made her biggest move yet. The panelists spoke in turn. Nothing they said was surprising. In fact, it almost sounded like a script they had memorized. One panelist stated, "Bias is merely a result of people's misunderstandings." Another added, "The media presents the truth, interpretation is up to you." Then Jennifer Langston spoke. Her voice carried a firm yet instructive tone. "Facts do not have a political agenda," she said before adding, "The press is simply a tool that ensures the public has access to accurate information." At that moment, Karoline saw the game being played more clearly. This wasn't just a debate. The people at this table weren't merely defending the idea that media bias didn't exist. They were actively trying to invalidate any criticism of it. Journalism wasn't just about presenting the truth, it was about deciding which truth to present. And that was where the double standard came into play. Now, it was Karoline's turn. She let her gaze sweep over the other panelists, taking a brief pause. She wouldn't rush. Reacting carelessly would only give them more power. Instead, she loosely clasped her hands on the table and leaned in slightly. "We all agree that the press has a responsibility to inform the public," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a tension beneath it. "But the real question is this: what information is chosen to be presented? And by what standards? Who decides what qualifies as accurate information?" For the first time, the once confident panelists fell into a brief silence. Whitman's lips curled into a faint smile, but Karoline knew he was already crafting a new strategy in his mind, recalibrating in real time. "Karoline, I think you may be shifting the conversation in a different direction," Whitman said, maintaining his facade of neutrality. "There are, of course, concerns about accuracy and bias in reporting. But wouldn't it be unfair to suggest that the entire press is distorted?" Karoline didn't look away. This was their test. If she didn't frame her words carefully, they would paint her as an extremist, someone unreliable. But she could play this game better than they could. "I'm not here to accuse the press," Karoline said, choosing her words with precision. "I'm simply questioning how the same event is covered differently depending on the context. If one side's mistakes make headlines for days, while the other sides are barely reported, can we really call that a coincidence?" Whitman hesitated for just a moment. The other panelists turned to Karoline, but no one spoke immediately, because they knew this was an unavoidable question, and how they answered it could expose their own contradictions. The tension in the studio grew thicker. Karoline had seen the trap they had set for her, but now she was rewriting the rules of the game. That night, she wasn't just there to debate. She was there to reveal the truth, and she hadn't even made her biggest move yet. Karoline could feel the impact of her words rippling through the room. The brief flickers of stillness on their faces, the unease lurking behind carefully curated smiles. Everyone was waiting. They wanted to see how Whitman would respond, how he would assert his authority. But Karoline was waiting too. She knew they wanted to corner her, but she wasn't going to let them. Whitman, ever the professional, gave a slight nod. "These are serious claims," he said in a smooth yet firm tone. "However, instead of blaming journalism, shouldn't we be discussing ways to combat misinformation?" A faint smile crossed Karoline's lips. There it was, the move she had been anticipating. "Combating misinformation?" she repeated, letting a touch of surprise seep into her voice. "To fight misinformation, we first have to question where it comes from. If the media exists to inform the public, then why are certain stories framed in misleading ways? Why are some truths censored?" These questions landed like a grenade in the middle of the table. One of the panelists, Jennifer Langston, quickly jumped in. "Karoline, are you implying that journalists deliberately withhold information? That's a very serious accusation." Karoline turned her gaze toward Jennifer. "I'm not implying anything," she said. "I'm simply looking at the facts." Last year, the same story broke about two different political figures. One made headlines for days. The other, barely a mention. Why? Jennifer hesitated. She didn't have an immediate answer. A brief silence settled over the panel. Karoline pressed on. "Was that just an oversight?" she asked. "Or is it part of a system that decides what the public should and shouldn't be talking about?" Whitman moved to reclaim control of the discussion. "Karoline, the primary goal of the media is to inform the public," he said. "But sometimes, the framing of a story is shaped in a way that serves the greater good." Karoline knew exactly why he chose those words. "The greater good?" she echoed. "Isn't that entirely dependent on the narrative being pushed?" The atmosphere in the studio grew heavier. This conversation had long since strayed beyond the boundaries they had intended. But Karoline was only getting started. A murmur spread through the audience. Karoline took a brief pause, then turned her gaze directly to the camera. "I didn't come here tonight just to debate opinions," she said. "I came here to reveal the truth. There was a time for everything, and reacting too soon would mean falling right into their game." So she listened first. She observed how words were chosen, how emphasis was skillfully placed, how perception was subtly manipulated. Everyone at that table had years of experience, masters at steering discussions. But Karoline wasn't just another panelist, she was the one who would break the game. And now, it was her turn. She clasped her hands loosely on the table, leaning forward slightly. The cold studio lights cast a sharp glow on her face as her voice rose, clear and unwavering. This is about double standards. Some people make headlines over the smallest mistakes, while others do the same things and get ignored. This isn't just bias, it's outright deception. Her words echoed through the studio, and for a brief moment, silence followed. The pre-crafted narrative had taken an unexpected hit. Expressions on the panelists' faces shifted, some frowned, others forced faint smiles. But Karoline caught their fleeting reactions. They had underestimated her. They had expected her to be unprepared, defenseless, someone who would crumble under pressure. But now, they realized they were facing something else entirely. Charles Whitman, after a brief pause, leaned into his mic with a practiced, artificial smile. "Could you elaborate on that, Karoline?" he asked, his voice smooth, but his subtext was clear. "I'm waiting for you to slip up." Without breaking eye contact, Karoline continued. "Of course," she said. "For example, some politicians' past statements are dragged back into the spotlight even after 10 years, while others' blatant lies are forgotten before a single news cycle is complete. Do you really believe that's impartiality? Or when some scandals dominate headlines for weeks while others are quietly brushed aside, are we supposed to believe that's just a coincidence?" Whitman's smile didn't fade, but his eyes narrowed slightly. The tension in the studio was palpable. One of the panelists, Jennifer Langston, quickly stepped in. "There will always be debates about how the media covers events," she said, her voice professionally modulated. "But we must remember that journalists always strive to present the most accurate information they have. The extent to which a story resonates depends entirely on public interest." Karoline tilted her head slightly, a subtle expression crossing her face. "Is that so?" she said. "Then who shapes public interest? Which stories are amplified for days, and which ones disappear within hours? Do you really think that's purely organic?" Langston averted her gaze, choosing her words carefully. Sensing the need to regain control, Whitman stepped in. "Of course the media is powerful," he said, his tone conciliatory. "But our responsibility is to report objectively, not to manipulate public perception." Karoline nodded, but it wasn't agreement. "So you're saying public perception isn't being shaped?" she asked, her voice calm as a shadow but carrying an unmistakable challenge. "When some stories are echoed across every platform, while others barely make it into the news, is that just by chance?" The silence in the studio had deepened. This was no longer a routine debate. The conversation had broken free from its pre-planned script. Karoline wasn't here just to defend herself, she was here to expose the cracks in the system. They had thought they could silence her, trap her, box her in. What they didn't realize was that this was exactly the moment she had been waiting for, and she wasn't finished yet. "Don't try to believe me just by listening. I'll show you the truth." Karoline's voice cut through the studio like a knife. She wasn't just another guest, not just another speaker. She was here to tear down the illusion of false neutrality. And now, she was making her first move. One by one, the documents she had prepared, the headlines, the striking video clips all projected onto the screen. In a matter of seconds, the entire atmosphere shifted. First, shock, then, an unsettling silence. No one had expected this. As the footage kept rolling, everyone realized Karoline wasn't here to speculate. She had come with evidence. She exposed how the same events were framed in completely opposite ways depending on the political figure involved. One person's actions were praised as a brave stance, while the same act by another was condemned as a dangerous provocation. Identical statements were stripped of context, used to uplift one side and discredit the other. Headlines manipulated, interviews cut and rearranged, critical details conveniently omitted. Were these just simple mistakes? Or was this systematic manipulation? Charles Whitman's face tensed ever so slightly behind his professional mask. As someone who had spent years in the media world, he knew how to handle crisis moments. But this was something he couldn't control. Karoline wasn't just making accusations. She was presenting undeniable facts. And most importantly, the audience was seeing it with their own eyes. One by one, the panelists went on the defensive. "We shouldn't take these incidents out of context," one of them said. "The media's job is to inform, not to influence," another added. But Karoline placed her hand firmly on the table, locking eyes with Whitman. "Then tell me, why are there two different narratives for the same event? Why are the facts molded to fit the desired story?" The studio was suffocating with tension. They tried to divert, to shift the conversation, But Karoline didn't back down. The video clips kept playing. A journalist's harsh criticism of a particular politician. The same journalist completely excusing a similar situation when it involved someone else. The double standard was undeniable now. The audience wasn't missing a second of it. Social media had erupted. Karoline's evidence had reached millions within seconds. Is the media truly objective? Is the press manipulating us? What have we believed to be true all these years? These questions could no longer be ignored. Charles Whitman made one last attempt to regain control. The media always strives to report the truth, he said, choosing his words carefully. But we must remember journalists are human too. Absolute neutrality isn't always possible. A defense that sounded suspiciously like an admission. But Karoline didn't stop there. So, you admit to being biased, she said, her voice calm yet razor-sharp. The real issue isn't having a bias. The real issue is pretending it doesn't exist. The real issue is failing to present the truth in its raw, unfiltered form. The program's format had completely unraveled. The discussion had spiraled beyond anyone's control. The studio was tense. The viewers stunned. Karoline Leavitt hadn't just participated in a panel discussion. She had pulled the thread on the media's carefully woven narrative, forcing people to question what was real. The debate was no longer unfolding as they had planned. At first, they thought they could corner Karoline, isolate her, weaken her arguments, and maintain the illusion of media neutrality to assert dominance. But things had taken a sharp turn. Karoline had not only come armed with strong arguments, but with concrete evidence. And now, she was the one cornering them. Charles Whitman, drawing on years of experience, tried to diffuse the situation, to steer the conversation elsewhere. With a composed expression, he leaned forward and made one last move. But what about the freedom of the press? Isn't this kind of criticism an attempt to silence journalism? It was a common tactic, framing Karoline's words as an attack on press freedom, painting her as a dangerous figure in the eyes of the audience. But Karoline had already seen through this game. She wasn't going to play by their rules. She took a deep breath, locked eyes with Whitman, and responded, her voice unwavering. A free press should ensure that the public knows the truth. But if the press is only pushing its own narrative, that's not freedom, it's propaganda. Her words hung in the air. The brief silence that followed only amplified the tension in the studio. This was it, the sentence no one had dared to say out loud was now echoing across the room. The panelists scrambled to react, but they had lost control of the narrative. What was supposed to be a neatly framed discussion for the viewers had unraveled entirely. People were now questioning what they had long accepted as truth. The so-called neutral media had just been exposed for how selective it truly was. That single sentence from Karoline didn't just shift the course of the debate, it altered everything that came after. Even after the broadcast ended, its impact remained. Outside the studio, journalists, columnists, social media, everyone was talking about one thing: how Karoline Leavitt had pulled back the curtain on the media. Some praised her courage. Others launched attacks. Major news networks tried to downplay the most crucial moments of the discussion. But social media was uncontrollable. People started sharing clips. Karoline's words reached millions. As days passed, the ripple effect grew. More and more people began questioning the news they consume. Are they really telling us the truth? Is this journalism? Or just sensationalism? Is the media shaping its own agenda? The questions multiplied. Trust eroded. Karoline's stand wasn't just another panel discussion. It was a breaking point, a direct challenge to the media's status quo. And it was clear the echoes of this debate would be heard for a long time.